Small organizations often struggle with understanding this.
Mm.
Maybe you're a small company, you hire one or two salespeople, and one's really good, but you don't even know why. You haven't measured anything. How many calls do they make? Do they make a lot of meetings? Are they just really personable? Is it
Mm.
their energy level? And so I think that just as you need to create relationships with your clients, you need to understand what it is that you're doing to make those things happen.
Warning: Damian Andrews' growing revenue and profit, if implemented, will put more money in your pocket. Please use with caution.
Welcome to Damian Andrews' Growing Revenue and Profit with international speaker and revenue and growth specialist, Damian Andrews. This is your source for practical, usable, and simple action steps that you can do every day to put more money in your pocket. And now, the host of Damian Andrews' Growing Revenue and Profit, Damian Andrews.
And the crowd cheers wildly to the trumpeting blasts of elephants sliding through eyes of needles. This is Damian Andrews' Growing Revenue and Profit, the program that deals with all things that puts more cash in your pocket. This is the show that handles your revenue riddles, profit puzzles, operational oddities, and culture conundrums. I am the one, the only Damian Andrews, and on this show is the amazing and wonderful John Arancio. Now, John is the co-founder of Wintec Group Inc., a New York-based CRM software reseller and application support specialty firm. And for over 25 years, he has gained recognition for helping his clients establish easy, reproducible selling processes that converts leads into closed sales, which is what we want more of. John, pleasure to have you on the show.
Thanks so much. Appreciate you having me.
It's wonderful. Sales is always such a topic that people seem to struggle with a lot. There seems to be some simple processes there, but implementation seems to be a different thing. From your experience, you've got 25 years of business experience and successful business experience. Talk us through your struggles, and was it easy to implement the sales? Was it easy to build that up in your process?
Well, I came to this through sales itself. So I had a sales job where, and this is before, I did not have a computer on my desk when I started selling. So I have a very different appreciation for the technology now because it was sorely lacking. And I was working off a notebook and a series of books called the Thomas Register. And I would dig in the register for names of businesses that were in the industry I was calling on. It was chemicals at the time. And we would try to make connections and log who you talk to. So I had to make daily call reports, weekly call reports, monthly reports, and outline, who was getting close and what was I doing. And I had a high volume of calls, and it was difficult to manage. So at that firm, I implemented several different CRM solutions, including eventually the one that I'm working on and supporting today. But the key element was getting out of the paper and into something indexed where I could quickly look up a person and their history and their contact information. At the very low level, that was the way it started.
I love that you mentioned that because I'm older than I look too, and I remember not having a computer as well, and certainly not having AI, which has made things very different in these current times.
It's a totally different story. And when we first started selling CRM to people, there was a huge resistance from salespeople who had their Franklin Planner or the little black book, and they wanted to hold that tight. And the companies or the ownership of the businesses generally wanted to go with a more systemized approach because they felt that the relationships were the company's property. And it was challenging to push it out the door, but there was never much of an argument from efficiency because using it myself, I was clear I could make more calls and be more effective when I knew what I said the last time. And if somebody said, call me back in 6 months, you hit them on the spot and you're there for the season. And, you will be more productive with a good CRM. So the tools that are out there do help salespeople. I think the challenge that you alluded to is you need to implement the right solution for your business problem. You can't just go and get something and say, I'm going to bend this to my will, because the technologies do different things. They're strong in certain elements and not at others. So I feel that the biggest need or requirement when you're entering a CRM project is pausing and looking at what you actually do and what you need. Otherwise, you'll end up buying the wrong tool.
And how much of that, because good salespeople know that sales is all about relationships. It's about creating that connection and understanding the person's need and being able to fulfill that need and then build the trust. At the end of the day, the sales process is about trust. They trust that you're going to deliver what you say you're going to deliver. How much is it important to create that efficiency? Because again, we've got a limited amount of time in the day. We've got 24 hours, certainly not working for that 24 hours, but as a salesperson, there's a lot of people you need to manage to build those relationships with. How does the CRM actually help make that more efficient?
I think it drives the type of behavior you've determined works best. So as an organization, and small organizations often struggle with understanding this. Maybe you're a small company, you hire one or two salespeople and one's really good, but you don't even know why. You haven't measured anything. How many calls do they make? Do they make a lot of meetings? Are they just really personable? Is it their energy level? And so I think that just as you need to create relationships with your clients, you need to understand what it is that you're doing to make those things happen. The CRMs are very good at providing insight into leading indicators and pipe. Leading indicators would be, how many times do you have to call, email, text, meet, do it again, video meeting, till you get penetration and create something of a feedback loop between you and the client. And then you have, on pipeline indicators just to log, well, this is a project of this value due at this date. These are all useful things to a sales organization, but you're not going to create the relationships that manage that as efficiently if you can't quickly get to what you need when you're doing your job. Because you're going to have your window of time to make calls, and you can't call people at 6 a.m. because they're not at their desk. So you have to use your time judiciously. And if you travel, you have to use it even more judiciously, because you can only squeeze so many meetings in. So it's a situation where you want to make every shot count and use the last thing that you did and the previous experiences to prepare you for the next touch point. That way you're not walking in saying, hey, what do you think of this new product that they've already eliminated?
Well, exactly. And you mentioned about that person that is really, really good at what they do. And let's say your company's got your John or your Damien in there, and they're doing fantastically. But how does the CRM help create that consistency across the board? That it's not just in sometimes people don't they might have a bad day or bad week, or they might have something that affects their relationship, so their performance doesn't go so well. And then also too, making that consistency across multiple salespeople. How does the CRM help that?
I think it does it a number of different ways, but I think the most prominent point is managing your follow-ups. So there'll be a certain point of cold prospecting, but as soon as you get into a cycle of callbacks, spacing those out appropriately is the way to make the most money. You can't call people the next day. They probably aren't ready for you, and you can't wait a year or you'll miss them. So load balancing your own time so that you have enough follow-up touches is essential. I learned from a customer years ago that he had his team rate accounts. You're going to visit the A accounts every month. You're going to visit the B accounts this frequently. And then he said, how many A accounts do you have? And people would say, I've got 500. And he'd say, well, you can't make those visits in a year. We've decided an A account gets this many visits. There aren't enough days. You have 250 work days. How are you going to make those visits? So it makes people assess
Mm.
where their energy is and what they're going to do with their territory. And if you think you can manage 500 accounts, that you're only giving it a cursory shot because you don't have enough time to do it. So you have to actually appreciate your own time and resources and apply them appropriately. But the task management of a CRM, being able to come in the morning and see what you need to do based on things that you prepared for a day, a week, a month ago, I think is the most essential part of at least for the clients that I deal with who do a lot of outbound calling. They're chasing customers to build relationship. Very non-transactional. They're looking after customers and trying to get them to a point where they'll book orders on their own.
Yeah. That word that you used there, well, two words, follow-ups. And it's kind of appears from my experience of dealing with salespeople that becomes something that's kind of not really done so much. They'll reach out and then they won't hear. They'll get a no and won't hear again. How important does a CRM play in making that monitoring for a business going, okay, are they following up?
It's probably the number one thing the owners of companies that come to me worry about is that they've spent all this money on marketing and additional money on preparing a sales team to send out a quote. They generate the quote and then nobody makes a call. And somebody else gets it because they make a phone call or send an email or do some follow-up. So that's the one that keeps the sales leaders that I talk to up at night, is that they're afraid their teams do a great job of pushing it out, the quote or the SOW, and then they move on to the next because it's a lot of work and they have to do it, and they forget about the finalizing it. And in sales, people have other things to do. You're not the only thing on their list. You have to climb into their world, and you may have done a very good quote, but they look at it, they have one question, they don't have time to follow up, and it's very hard to reach people. Let's face it, it's getting much more difficult to connect with people, but that makes follow-up more important, not less important. I think the hope that you can just automate this stuff is not properly placed. You mentioned AI. Can we automate it and do it? I think AI right now can make your work product better. Maybe it'll make your quote better or make your pitch better. But I don't think it'll get your customer to talk to you better, because they're getting a million automated emails and a million automated text and calls all the time. So they're getting less responsive to that. And so the more personal you can make it and the more aggressive you can be about it, I think that you increase your chances.
Do you get a bit of pushback and competition? Well, competition not the right word, but resistance between the two. Like you said, the business owner wants that clarity, what's happening, but the salespeople may not, especially if they're not great, may not be wanting to do that because they just there's a component of concern for making those calls and getting that rejection, because it does take a certain type of person to be able to handle that kind of rejection consistently and keep bouncing back.
I think that that's the best part of a CRM, is that you find out they're not the right person quicker. You will find out sooner or later.
Yeah.
18 months is very expensive. 6 months is a lot less expensive. So if you can learn that this person's not doing what you need, then you can make the job better for both of you much quicker. So there is resistance. There's resistance on multiple levels, but a lot of it is just sales culture. If you built your sales organization kind of organically, like we started growing and we took somebody out of operations, said, all right, you're going to just sell now. And that worked out great. And you hired another person. They didn't work out. So you tried a few times. Now you have this sort of, everybody does it the way they do it. When you bring a system in, there's going to be pushback because you're making people change. And I rarely get situations where everybody's on board right away. It happens. Sometimes they're struggling internally with a little more structure would be helpful, but more typically, they don't want to do it for their own reasons. Could be that they don't make a lot of calls and don't want anybody to know, or it could be they make plenty of calls, they just don't want to take time to log it. But in the end of the day, if the owner wants to know what's happening, if the manager wants to know what's happening, somebody has to put it in a system. And then you look at reports. If you don't have a dashboard, you're going to have to sit down with your salespeople and have long conversations constantly. And that's a different problem. That's micromanaging. So at some point, there'll be a challenge to face socially with your sales team. But at the end of the day, I feel like we're further along. Years ago, it was very hard to convince anybody to even pick up a laptop because they hadn't been using them.
Yes.
I think we're past that. You have to check email. So for salespeople, CRM is like email. It's on their desk, it's up, and it's working all the time. When they're off work, that's when it doesn't work, and barely, because their phone's going off, right? It's the same thing. It's the same thing.
That's a whole component of time management in there, which again, I go on about
Yeah,
time management being a misnomer because time's constant and there's 24 hours for everybody. It's effort.
exactly.
It's important. And I have a whole program called Max Time on that we deal with that. But coming back to your point as a business owner, from your experience as well, as you mentioned, you're going to find out eventually having those difficult discussions. There's a point where we have to have those difficult discussions. And I know from my experience, when I hire salespeople, it doesn't matter how fabulous they are in their video that they'll submit or whatever. The first thing I say when they come into it and say, "Yeah, see what you said, but I don't really get it. I don't think you're that good," and see how they respond to that, and then I'll keep rejecting it and see if they keep bouncing back. But that's not easy to do because you're becoming an unlikable person. And I've had people tell me when they've got the job, "We thought you were a right prick in the interview, but you're really a nice guy." And it's like, well, yeah, I needed to find out what your character was before you
Yeah.
got the job. But how does a person, from your experience, how have you done that? How have you managed to be able to have those conversations, go, "Hey, this is not personal. This is a job. There's a transaction here. We've got a company to run," and balance that so you're able to get that information?
That took the longest, and it's an ongoing. I still think I'm learning. Um, the best thing that we've done, particularly with salespeople, is look at the number of communications they make, because
Yeah.
that means they're touching people. So it's a number we can look at that's not objective. Like you can look at somebody and say, "I don't think you're doing a great job," but looking at a number is not something that you can debate very deeply.
Yeah.
And we work on those sorts of things because they're more structured and less personal.
Mhm.
But ultimately, there is I think for salespeople, for employees in general, but for salespeople, what I'm looking for is people who can take responsibility so I don't have to. So
Mm.
if I'm thinking, is this salesperson doing enough? Would they do the right thing? Or are they just bouncing back to me every time they run into a wall? Oh, how do I do this? How do I do that? Whereas we want people that are more self-starting.
Mhm.
Um, you see that right away. But as far as the sales side goes, looking at those activity metrics is critical.
Yeah.
And then we also found, actually, for us, the follow-ups were a big thing too, because we quickly were able to get people to do activity because they want to see that number.
Mhm.
But then I did find gaps in follow-up, and we had to look at other things to make sure after a call, how are you going to get back to them? And
Mm.
there's plenty of people who think they're going to remember, or they'll wait for them to call back. And we don't operate on a basis that the customer's going to call back. That's a
Yeah.
terrible way to retain clients.
Yes.
So that's a separate cultural distinction. And I don't think you can come across particularly nice if you're just changing someone's personal approach to it. I think
Mm.
you have to just make sure they understand it's in the job. We did take care in recent years of building the activities and the metrics into the job description. So when you're getting hired, you're hired into a job that has this as a part of it,
Mm.
and you're going to be evaluated on these things. So at least that's not a surprise later on.
Yeah.
But in the end of the day, people will do what they do, and we'll find out as they work.
Yeah. I love that you're incorporating that into that process at the start, saying, "Hey, these are the metrics that we're going to assess you on." Because again, that's the component. We can get really nice and be friendly at the start, and then there's all this awakening. And I had that experience. I was the CEO of one organization, and when we had the initial meetings and explaining all the situations, um, and and then as we progress, all of a sudden it's like their understanding and my understanding were very, very different. And it became a source of tension. And then finally, I just said, "Look, I'm going to stand down because this is not working for either of us." and took that step back, but it was because we didn't clarify that at the start. So I love that you've got those metrics that are not emotional. They're arbitrary. It's like, have you made
Yeah.
this many calls? Have you made this many follow-ups? How do you, taking that a step further, when we're looking at, let's take it from the employee to the customer side of things. How do you manage the quality of the customer? These people weren't a client. I'll give you this story. There were three gentlemen who had a plumbing business. That's the short story. They were turning over 15 mil, working flat out, constant problems, issues, 7 days a week. And they decided we're just going to cull what we consider to be the bad customers. And their revenue dropped from 15 mil to 10 mil. So substantial drop in revenue. They got all their time back, so they were just working during the day. But what they also found was their profitability went up. So even though the revenue dropped a third, the money that they kept actually went up. How can you use a CRM to better manage the quality of the customer that you're dealing with to ensure that higher level of profitability, that net margin or even gross, net profit?
Yeah, I think you would, between the CRM and the finance or ERP system, you would track your input costs as you're working. And for us, we track our hours, right? So in a consultancy, your labor is the main resource that runs out and that you can track. So if we have agreements with people, we know how many hours we've spent, and we can look back at the year and say, did the way that we did it, for some clients, we have an annual agreement, some we bill just as we go. And in those cases, you're going to be one-to-one.
Yeah.
But you should evaluate, did you go over or under? And we go both ways, and we kind of have to tolerate that to an extent, because there are some years where there's a project that eats up more time than we thought, and the next year we come out ahead on the billing, right? But if you want steady revenue, having a managed service relationship can be very beneficial. So we found that there's some tolerance for things moving a little bit out of line, but you can just adjust it year to year if they seem to be growing in a direction that you don't like. And most likely that's on labor, and it's something that you can manage just because you can track it and just look back. In the moment, I don't have an easy solution, because you're probably going to accept the work and deal with it, especially if you're on an agreement. Like in a consultancy, if they say something's broken, we fix it. We're not going to get into the minutia in the moment. But I do think you look back and you make sure, and you can definitely check which clients are profitable and which ones are not. There is greater transactional profitability on smaller clients, but they're harder to manage. But they also give you, if one goes away, it's not as impactful. So we still like to have a range of clients for the stability of it, and just for maintaining as many customers as we can. And I'm sure we take hits on profit in some circumstances, but if we can build a good long-term relationship, we have a view of it for a couple of years long. So we look at relationships over, say, 5 years. That term needs to work. In any given year, I might not make out as well as I'd like on a certain client. So we just will look at the hours that we spent on our time.
And from that, where you mentioned about that long-term value of the customer, using a CRM in that initial phase, how can you best use that to assess, this is a customer, that has the potential to be a long-term customer that's viable for us, rather than chasing someone that might be a quick one-off deal that is going to disappear and you spend a lot of time and it doesn't go anywhere?
It's the ideal situation is you identify the requirements and make sure the target customer and you and what you do are close. We're very good with commercial, where we know the size of customer. Like a very large customer with their own staff may not need our services as much. We may have a product that they like, and we may have a little bit of services with them when something's really broken, but they're going to do most of the work themselves. So the hours for us are modest in that case, even though the client may be large. Whereas small clients typically don't have any staff to do the work and would rather hire a part of a person for some of the job that has to be done, and not have to bring any of it in-house. So they look at us a different way. So we view the size and shape of the customer and it through the lens of like need, and make sure the needs line up well.
Okay.
So we'll make our best effort either way, but that we can tell based on that profile whether they're going to, be the type of client.
Yeah, understand. And with the CRM and setting up a business, when we're starting out a business, we've got so many different things that we need to be focusing on. Obviously, there's lots of fires we're putting out. There's lots of activity we're doing just to get the thing up and go and get those clients. How can someone, use a CRM? How would they set that up at the beginning? Because a lot of times that's probably not what they're thinking about, a CRM and that kind of system, although it would be very, very helpful in my opinion. What can someone do to actually be prepared for that and start their operation with a really, really good CRM?
The startups are in a class by themselves because not all of the startups know where they're going.
Mm,
They have a plan, but
mm,
very often in the beginning, they're just raising funds and getting the name out and setting up the technology. And I've talked to startups, and it's interesting. Usually, there's some really strong people you can connect with at these companies, but they know what they don't know. You can't really lay a CRM in if you don't know what you're going to be doing,
mm,
because what is it? I one client I talked to, she said, "Yeah, we're really early, and we're not we're basically going through distribution right now, and these other people are selling our stuff, but we plan to take it in-house and do these relationship building, but we're a year or two away. So until they're needing it,
mm,
they would use the CRM initially just to manage vendors and investors, right? That's all they care about in the beginning. But
mhm.
that might look really different than something where you're going to sell your stuff.
Yeah.
So it may not be possible for a very new company that hasn't landed on what their process is going to be to find a good CRM, or they may find something and outgrow it in a minute or undergrow it, meaning they bought the wrong thing and they need to move to the left or right to find the right solution. So I wouldn't fault a startup for not having a CRM. They should probably have something or make something on their own, even if it's a spreadsheet to start. But they should have a plan on where they want to get to, and what they have to have enough staff. Some of these companies don't even have the sales staff initially.
Yes.
It's just they're outsourcing everything until they can get out of that incubation phase.
Mm. So with that, is there key principles that should apply? Because as you said, you might get something that doesn't perform, or you might have something that's way too complicated for what you need. What are some key principles that people should focus on when they're looking at a CRM?
I think the big first of all, you have to figure out how many people are going to touch it, because
Mm,
that's going to indicate how many dollars you'll have for the system, and also as you get larger you can afford more support and
mm,
maybe bring some of that in house. So knowing how big the project is different between 3 and 30, right? So you need to know what your scale is. If you're an enterprise, is it 100 or 1,000?
yeah.
Whatever that number is, that's something I think it's very important, and understanding kind of where you're going to grow. If you're at 5 and you're going to go to 25, you should have a picture of that. If you don't have any picture, it gets really tough what to do. And then I think you mentioned earlier relationship management. What does your sale look like? Is it a long-term sale where you're talking to a few people and bringing in some big whales to buy your stuff? Is it a lot of little relationships? Are the salespeople taking a lot of inbound calls? Are they out, driving the business, looking for stuff? So once you understand the shape of what you're doing, there'll be activities that your people are going to do with or without technology. That helps you look for what you're going to buy,
Mm,
because then you can express needs and watch the technology in demos and in trials do what you want it to do. Because they're all going to tell you, we can do that. There's nobody that can't do things, but they may not do it quickly enough, right? There's one thing to have I can save an email. Then how many clicks does it take? Does it take all day? Is it slow? Is it, and when I'm getting in there, is it very intuitive? Because that's a behavior I may do 20, 50, 100 times a day.
yeah.
Whereas if it's something you're going to do once a day, you may not care how long it takes.
Mm,
So I think it's hard to wrap your head around exactly check boxes are really no good in a CRM evaluation. Does it do it? Does it not do it? You need to know, what does it do well of the 5 or 10 things that are constants in your world.
Yeah.
You may say it's the follow-ups in the pipeline, or somebody may say, I need to know all their touches on the clients, how many times they do it, really good reporting. If you've done a couple of these projects before, you may say it needs to not be horrendously complicated. You may have gone through this where the cost of just turning it on was not what you expected. So all those things go into your requirements.
Yeah.
And that will help you figure out who you want to be talking to when you launch.
And how do you manage that? I mean, if you put yourself in the business owner's shoes or business manager's shoes, whichever one it is, and you're looking at a CRM, because as you said, if you go to someone and say, I've got this problem, they're going to say, yes, I can do that. That's just the
Absolutely.
response. And you and I probably have got the experience, well, I'll say we both have got the experience if someone's talking to us, and very quickly we'll assess, they can't, because I have had those conversations. I go, yeah, I can do that. And then I'll ask a couple of questions and I'm going, no, they can't. They don't have the skill to do that. But for someone that isn't like us, it doesn't have that skill set, what are some of the key things that they should be looking at to ask those kind of questions to see whether this person can actually do what they say they're going to do?
Well, I think seeing is believing.
Mm-hmm.
So you should watch it happen and maybe get a little bit of your own hands on it to make sure you can do what you need to do. I think that delegating to a demo or a video is super risky because they've lined up the world neatly and easily for their benefit. So I think getting a trial or testing it yourself, and you're limited in resources, so you have to winnow people down to a certain point. But practicing on it with some guidance, there's no harm in having help if you can't figure stuff out, but looking at it, making sure that, yeah, that's practical. I can ask my team to do that all day long, and I can expect that they're going to put it in, and I'm going to look at that report and see that activity. And that this is going to be, able to handle what we've got, whatever that is, because everybody's different. And understanding the wrinkles of your requirements and watching how people approach it. Every time you say something, do they say, we can customize that? This is money, right? So you may not be amenable to that. That's something worth finding out right away. How much do you do right out of the box? How much do I have to build? Is all of this custom? And then, what's my budget? If you have plenty of budget, there's lots of choices.
Yeah.
If you have a limited budget, you need to buy right software for your technology and your budget, because you will not be able to afford to turn on systems that are built for an enterprise.
Yeah, and that is that cost component. And I love that you mentioned about touching, because I had that experience myself outside of a CRM, a different system, where I'd delegated that to someone to do, and they've come out and gone, yeah, can do this, this, and this. And then, okay, let's go ahead. And we got it. And then I started using it and I was like, this is not doing everything that it needs to do. And it was,
we're not doing it well. Those are they're equivalent statements.
yeah.
If it doesn't do it at all, that's bad. But if it does it in sort of a cursory way, and it takes a really long time and it's impractical for your need, I don't see any benefit to it. It's the same thing as saying it doesn't really do what I want. And so it goes right back to knowing what you want. The less you know about what you want, the more you're going to get somebody else's solution. And the more you understand your needs, the closer you'll get to this will work for us. And it's not easy, and there's no perfect. I don't think, at least for small businesses, they're rarely going to find something that drops in without any help. But you can get very close to what you need if you know what your side of it looks like and what will work for you.
Is that part of that process too, where you mentioned it's not perfect? Because I think there's a lot of times where we have this expectation of finding this thing that's going to do everything, but in reality, it's a kind of a compromise in that sense, and we've got to manage our own expectations. Is that part of that process as well?
It's part of the process of anything I've ever gotten, not just CRM, but any systems.
Yeah.
They work to a point, and then there's parts that are not ideal and a little bumpy, and you say, okay, well, can we live with that? And it comes to prioritization. What's the most important couple of things? And I don't think it's more than 5 or 6 things that a CRM has to do well. I would guess that of my clients, most use 3 or 4 features extremely heavily, constantly. And then they use other elements of it, but what makes or breaks the requirement is that it does this part. It manages the tracking of the notes, and it gives them a way to give the pipeline to the boss. It does integration with email. They do tons of email, something that is just an everyday, all day thing. I mean, my experience of Outlook, I don't think I use all the features in the email client, but I need it, and I need the things that it does, sending and receiving an email, and I get an alarm. Those things are necessary. So for me, I know the 2% of it that I need. And if you can get that delivered on what you buy, you're going to be happy with your investment. And if you don't, no matter how many things it does, you'll end up being shopping in a year, right? You'll come back and say, well, it was okay, and I guess, but not really what we wanted.
Is there a couple of key, I'm going to use the word principles, but key functions that a CRM should have that are generally across the board, or is it specific to each organization? Like you said, some might be heavy on sending emails.
They're strong in different elements. I think that they have perspectives. Some CRMs are very process oriented. They're going to take you from step 1 to step 2 to step 3, but they're miserable for building relationships. So if you have a project oriented process you're trying to manage, and sales is really not structured well for that. Sales is sort of bumpy and flows and comes and goes. But if you're doing construction and we need to dig a hole and then put stuff in the hole and get a bank loan and then build more stuff and go higher, I think there are CRMs that will do that well. And then there's CRMs that, like what we're doing, is more focusing on sales. So we have elements where we can manage a project, but our focus is more on sales projects. So you send out a statement of work, and then it's a 90-day window where they're making the decision, and you're progressing towards it, and you have some milestones to hit, and there's a sales plan, and there's for us, AI comes in and helping you prompt the client for questions and things that are relevant to them, and trying to direct you towards a close. And all along that, you're using a tool for follow-up, you're using a tool to track what's happened so you have good history, and that the rest of your organization knows what's going on. That's our focus. That's the things that we do. So to say that there's one set, CRM is really broad, and I think almost too broad for its own good, that businesses grab at CRM without, I don't think they explore their needs well enough sometimes to end up on the right path immediately. Usually, if they go down the wrong path, they'll find that out in a year or two and be back at it. But it is disruptive to change, right? You're bringing it in, you're training people, you're spending money. There's a resistance to throw that out. But if it doesn't hit the requirements, you'll be looking sooner than later.
And from that, if we take that a step further for the person managing the CRM, whether it's the business owner or you've got a specific person in there, when we talk about business skills, you've got entrepreneurs, and they talk about entrepreneurial skills. There's manager skills, which are different from entrepreneurial. Is there certain skills or personality types that are better suited to the CRM management? Is there certain traits that a person needs to develop to actually manage a CRM well? Particularly,
some of our clients delegate this to us because they don't want to touch it. But generally, the personality is somebody who is, they're sort of an analytical thinker, a little structured, so that they can picture, for practical purposes, what the users are going to do and confine them to good behaviors, right? So allowing enough permission for people to work, but not to maybe delete the whole thing or export the whole database to another company. But they're thinking in terms of like structured process. We're going to have a job. The job entails these things. How do we make this part? I think the word's small enough for the user base to see what they need to see, because the CRMs are going to let you show. There's usually more than too much. immediately, right? And so we usually spend time, even in our system, toning it down to
Mm.
the relevant items that matter to these folks so that they can stay focused, because you can get lost in the
Mm.
details. So people that can take some complexity and make it small, but really those that can work with other people and be I think they're usually between the boss and the end users, right? So they're keeping an eye on the team to make sure they're doing what they do, and they're translating the boss's, reporting requirements or management needs into how people are allowed to work in the CRM.
Mm.
And they watch the users, making sure they're using it. User adoption needs to be good for these projects to work. So looking at activity, if you said you're going to make a bunch of calls, those calls should be there. And so that's the type of person. And usually it's sometimes the owner or the manager, but a lot of times they delegate because their days more than overbooked, and they don't need to be in the details. And that's really where we come in, is we'll take that stuff from them and say, okay, this is we're going to translate what the business says into practice in the CRM, and then communicate that to the team.
Love that. And if we take it from looking at the journey that you've had with the clients that you've worked with, has there been any out of the box thinking innovations where you look and go, oh, wow, that's a real game changer or a different way of approaching? What are some of those experiences that you've had? And
Most of them are clients who have found really efficient ways of tying in their own stuff. So we have a system, but there are customers with many systems,
mm,
and when they can create a link between what they're doing in the CRM and some business intelligence suite that gives sales reporting that would otherwise be really hard to generate. I mean, if you go from having a 3-inch thick book of sales reports that you pour through by hand on a piece of paper, on green paper, the big wide ones, and you can now click a link in your CRM and see that relevant to that customer immediately.
yeah,
To me, that's taking away such a drag. I mean, the guys were describing how they used to take these big binders on the road with them because they never knew if they'd need to look at the
yeah,
last month's sales. And the last month's sales are in systems. They weren't in the CRM system, but they were accessible from it. And
yeah,
so the folks that can do that on the cheap impress me the most, because you can spend a ton of money integrating systems, but if you can do it with a low cost, and still present a view of something that's useful in the right moment,
mhm,
I think that's a win.
yeah,
A lot of companies spend big bucks on dashboards, and nobody looks at them because they have to go and log in, and it's a drag. But if you feed them that right from where they're working,
yeah,
if you put it right under their nose in the moment, they're talking to that client. Oh, yeah, I can check your sales. Now you're suddenly getting an adoption of this other system. So those are the two instances. They're related, but where you're able to jump from where you were into this other area that's not necessarily related to what the CRM's doing,
mhm,
but gives you an insight, and then you can jump back to your selling day.
yeah. And with that as well, taking that a step further with that innovation and processes, especially when we're implementing technology, we can get to a point where we lose that personal connection. And it become very because you mentioned process orientated before. There's some systems that are very process orientated, but then we start to lose that relationship. And I know from one of the things I've done in the past is like after New Year's, Christmas, New Year's, I've had a thing where I'll call the clients and specifically make it in my mind that I'm not making a sales call. This is just to find out how was your Christmas and New Year. What did you get up to? And it's amazing how many sales I've actually got out of that when I specifically haven't called out. And they said, oh, by the way, we've got this to do. How do you keep it personal when you're starting to get all this technology in there?
I force myself to do follow-up calls. We're on a subscription, so I avoid the renewal. I make sure I've got touches way before the renewal date.
Hmm.
So I schedule my follow-ups. So everything is structured. I don't just pick up the phone and make calls. That's really rare. But
Yeah.
I have planned calls at and around renewal and away from renewal, and they're just different types of conversations. and larger customers get more of them and smaller customers get fewer, but everybody gets touched so that I can have a conversation that's not loaded about, oh, this is coming up again and it's due and all that, where it's just, how is everything? Do we need to have a strategic conversation or just a social conversation? But what I find is that you never know. Sometimes you call people, they're too busy, and sometimes you hit it where, I've been stuck. I would have called you, but I don't even have time. And they'll give you 20 minutes and you can figure out something that would have been a fire. So my strategy is like yours. It's just Christmas comes throughout the year because my clients renew at different times.
Yep.
And I take time to just get to them however I can. And we communicate by phone's the most personal, but if I can't reach them by phone, we try different ways to make sure there's a touch and that we're not constantly emailing. We try to get off the electronic touches and get to a human being sooner or later.
So you structure within the CRM, even though it's very technologically based, you structure it around these touch points it might be just a friendly follow-up. Otherwise, it's
Absolutely.
and
Yeah.
you have that specifically in each, is it
For
system
every client.
you've got, where you have, okay, this is the call and here's a script for that particular call or an outline of a script?
Yep. It's for the in between calls, there doesn't have to be much structure at all. Just make sure everybody's happy and see what else there is to do. And just make sure, are there any other touch points that we missed that, we're not always going to get a great answer when we communicate with the client. We just want to receive as much information as we can.
Yeah.
But the key is to make those touches part of your work as important as the call to make sure they renew or they buy or they, what I mean? It's the same priority. If you want to maintain relationships, we have very close relationships with our customers. They know us on a first name basis. We know their staff. And that's a way a small business can compete with a large one. And we don't need to have them read off a 20-digit customer number to give them support.
Yeah.
We know who they are. We know how many licenses they own. We know what they're doing, how they're configured. So we're in a better position to help when they call in or when we reach out to them.
So if I'm hearing correctly, what you're saying is that every point within that CRM has a touch point, and part of that touch point, whether it's detailed scripted or just an outline, it's finding out more information about what's going on for them. Am I understanding that correctly?
Yeah, exactly. And what's next? What else do we need to do? Our technology keeps changing. A lot of clients, they buy a system and they sit the way, without prompting, they will not change from the day they bought it, even if it was 1990. And so you can often call clients and quote unquote sell them on things that have just been innovated that they, didn't take time to look at. And to me, that's a survival thing. You have to keep clients moving up, or they're going to look at something else and say, "Oh, it does this thing that you don't." When that's not even the case. So you have to keep on top of as much as you can where they're at, and that to me is one of the hardest things because you have to really slow down and talk to clients about what they're doing, exactly what they're doing, how is everything, but not just that, and what are you calling okay? I mean, if they say everything's fine, you have to actually dig in and make sure that it is. So we do our best to spend some time looking at what they do and making sure that we penetrate any problems that might be there or stagnation where they're just not evolving fast enough to keep up with the times.
I love that you mentioned that slow down, because that's something that I resonate with a lot, is taking that time to understand what's going on and really listen to what's going on. And as you can probably tell from this interview, I've got some pre-prepared questions, but it's really about listening to what you've got to say and having that conversation follow. How do you systematize that? I mean, it's something I've developed over the years, and certainly something I didn't do when I was younger and full of, thought I knew everything. Um, how do you systematize that in a CRM where if you've got multiple salespeople that they are slowing down because they've got quotas to meet and taking the time to build those relationships and gather that information?
I think it's either a lot of coaching or you separate the jobs.
Mm,
I've been coached both ways, and one person in particular was very adamant about there's a salesperson and there's an account manager. And
Mm.
if you're large enough, and I don't think that all small businesses can do that, but if you're large enough, the account managers operate in a different, they have different measurables and they're tasked differently. So they're not drawn away by their prospecting efforts
Hmm.
to, getting it new. They're also able to stop and make sure the customers, you're retaining them and that you're growing your business within it. So I think they're not necessarily the same exact skill sets, and it's just harder to hire when you have to put it all in the same person.
Mm.
Um, so I think it's a challenge. You can lay it out in there and say you have to have a certain number of these types of activities, and you can measure those things. But are they doing it the way you want? Questionable, because the good cold callers no aren't they don't slow down. They they're they're all about how many calls they can bang out in a day. They were all about the efficiency, and they tend not to be able to pause and uh, cultivate the relationship. That's just not their skill set. So sometimes you can separate it and just have different roles.
Yeah, love that. And as far as the products out there go, you've got the product maximizer as one of the products that you offer, and there's a number of different products out there. As far as working out the cost that of a CRM, and I noticed on your website you've got the how much will my CRM implementation cost? Can you tell us a bit about that and how people what they need to consider and what are the questions to ask in working out what they need to have so they can
Yeah.
calculate that cost?
Essentially, we always ask customers questions when we sit down with them to find out where they are and what they're, get a sense of their budget and get a sense of their requirements. So
Mm.
we created the calculator just as a way for people to connect. If they didn't want to talk to somebody and give out their personal information and hear follow up from an automated response, we gave them a calculator that asked some simple questions about how many people are involved in the project, what's the general focus of it, and is the system going to involve marketing? Is it going to involve connecting to other systems like accounting? So we asked some very basic questions just to give ballpark numbers so that you could get a sense of, what am I in for this? And it could be just, an elimination phase or just, oh, okay, these guys are in range, but it gives you a sense of what's possible. The numbers will be fairly accurate if you're fairly out of the box, and there'll be guesstimates. I think probably overages in some cases if it's custom, because we don't, custom is custom. You won't really know until you do an analysis and actually scope out what you're going to do. But at least it puts people into a dollar range where, for small businesses, they get a sense of this is what could be coming. So
Mm.
the calculator is just an anonymous way for people to talk to us and say, we've got a little project. This is what it might look like.
Yeah.
If you wanted to know more, you would connect with us at wintechgroup.com, and you would connect and communicate what you've gotten so far. And we would assess, oh, how deeply do you understand your requirements? And, where do you want to start? Sometimes the answer is just, okay, we just want to knock off this one bit. I
Mm.
need to get all my salespeople putting in what they're doing. I have no idea what they're doing. And, we can start small and get to a point where we can create value, but we're looking to create as much value as possible out of the box because the costs are lower, and that gives people more stickiness and more um, willingness to invest in a deeper integration with some other system or enhancement that is specialized. So we think those things are still a great idea, but we want to start in a place where you can walk before you run.
Mm. And some because you've got a number of different products on your website and that you offer. And can you tell us a bit about your ideal client that you work with? What sort of business are they, and
Certainly.
some of the key products that you offer that would help them?
So the key product that we're working with for CRM would be Maximizer, and the clientele for Maximizer tend to be small to mid-sized businesses with a sales team. So there are salespeople involved, maybe not the entire team. There may be people in operations or customer service that supplement the sales team, but some folks are out there chasing after customers. And I would say most of those are B2B businesses who are needing to create a relationship to sell. So not so transactional. Very few of those customers are going to have an e-store where people just buy stuff. They might have it supplement, but their job is to go stimulate the relationship so the customers place orders with them.
Mm-hmm.
And whether they're working from the phones or they're out in the field, they're doing things like tracking those communications, those calls, those meetings. They are being measured by those reports and dashboards on what they're doing, and they're using the CRM to measure their process. So how long has it been since I've talked to this client? Any clients that haven't been, if you're an account manager, are there any clients that haven't been called in 90 days? That's probably not a great idea. We can make a notification of that. So we're working on the system that the company wants and we're translating it into a technology. And then the other bit is, I think you mentioned earlier, the companies that need to structure their follow-up so that they need to pace themselves. Sometimes it's a long window of time. If you have a very long sales cycle, you're not going to be talking to them every week. How do you get back to them at the right points in time so that you optimize your time and theirs and are able to keep yourself present in their minds at the right moment? So B2B businesses, a lot of the companies we talk to, they're owner operated. And so they're owner operators. They're actually doing some of the sales. So they're in there with the sales team, not just delegating. They're either the sales manager or they're one of the crew, and they are using the system as well as watching reports. So many of our customers are run by executives that are in it all day long. And so small to mid-sized businesses, budget conscious, looking for a deployment that's affordable. Again, you can check the cost calculator out because we build the services costs into it. We'll give you the kind of the profile that we're looking for. They're sales leaders, they're tracking leading indicators, and they're generally measuring a pipeline.
And if they have more questions about how that operates, what's the best way to reach out to you? Is it to come directly, or is there more?
Yeah, you can reach me on LinkedIn or you can go to wintecgroup.com and you'll see many means of reaching us on the page. The calculator's there. There's no way to miss us.
Yes.
So that would be the best way to do it.
And we'll put those links in the show notes here. I'm looking at your website now, and definitely there's lots of different ways. Sales at wintecgroup.com, and you've got your phone number there. Obviously, you've got a blog there as well that people can learn more information about how the CRMs work. And before we go, is there anything if we're going to leave the audience with a takeaway, a key takeaway in a nutshell, your key wisdoms, what would it be that you want the audience to take away from this interview?
I think that the CRMs can be accessible if you know what you're looking for and you take time to figure out who you want to work with. What kind of relationship do you want? Do you want to have a giant company and call a help desk? Do you want to know who you're talking to? Do you know what you want? Are you willing and interested in delegating that? So understanding the kind of relationship you want to have with your vendor, it's like any vendor, will define it. The CRMs are just a heavy use tool where you're likely to need support at least at the beginning of the deployment, and you're going to want to know that you can rely on the people you're working with. So just creating the relationship with your vendors and internally understanding your needs.
Love that, John. It's been such a pleasure having you on the show, Growing Revenue and Profit, talking about the CRM, because it really is the heart of managing sales. It is the way of managing sales. It's the heart and soul of managing sales, and having good systems in place to do that is going to result in greater efficiency and productivity, not just with one person, but across a broad range of salespeople that you might have. John, thank you very much for taking the time, sharing the details of what Wintec Group does. I love that work that you're doing, and I really, really appreciate you taking the time.
Thanks so much.